Good morning, everybody out there, wherever you may be. Welcome to the first panel discussion of the day from Euromoney GlobalCapital Central Eastern European Forum, normally called the Vienna Conference, and still, I think, has a flavour of that fine city about it. This is the first of two panel discussions this morning with governors of central banks, and we're going to talk about the topic of rethinking the role of central banks and central bankers in a post-pandemic world. Just before I introduce the panelists, I'd encourage you all to open the chat box on your screen, close down full screen mode, and then you can see the chat, and indeed you can add questions or comments as we go along, and please do that. We'll keep an eye on those as the discussion progresses. So, to introduce the panelists, we have a glittering array of central bankers from 5 countries in the region. We have Anita Bezhoska, who is the governor of the National Bank of the Republic of North Macedonia. You can tell which one she is. Everybody has a little name badge underneath them. Some have their flags, so you can. In fact, everybody has a flag. Yes, everybody has a flag apart from you, Anita, and we know who you are, so that's good. Koba Gvenetadze is the chairman of the board of the National Bank of Georgia. Gent Sejko is the governor and chairman of the Supervisory Council of the Bank of Albania. Kyrylo Shevchenko is the still quite recently appointed governor of the National Bank of Ukraine. And Boštjan Vasle is the governor of the Bank of Slovenia. Now, you will have spotted immediately that Slovenia is a Eurozone country, so they're somewhat different from the rest of the people that we have here. Although, of course, Anita too runs an economy, runs a monetary system which is essentially Euroized as well. So, without any further preambles, I'm going to ask these panelists a sort of conceptual question. Sorry if it's a bit testing first thing in the morning to have this kind of philosophical question, but 3 of you were on this panel with me last year in person, and it's tempting to think that since then absolutely everything in the world has changed. But has it really changed? Anita, why don't you kick us off with your answer to that thought?
Okay, good morning, and first of all, many thanks for the invitation to be part of this event. I would say that today the world seems quite a different place in comparison with what we expected to be a year ago. Just recall, at this conference, we discussed certain setbacks of the global growth momentum, but the fear, I would say, of deep recession or having events such as Black Swan event seemed quite distant. What we focused was slowing down of the global growth for the first time in the last decade below 3%, reflecting globalization, trade tension, Brexit, and so on. But nevertheless, I think the expectation was that in the medium term, growth will slowly pick up to about 3% and remain hovering around this level. However, we are faced with a completely different picture today, since that the pandemic has set completely different scenery. We are faced with a pandemic crisis affecting all countries across the board. Only about 26 countries in the world are expected last year to be in a positive territory, none of them from the Europe. Thus, instead of experiencing a solid growth of about 3%, now expectation is for the last year decline of the global growth of about 4.4%. Region is not isolated. Again, 6.4% decline is expected for the region. And maybe importantly, it's important to mention that given the exogenous nature of this shock, initially it was expected that will be very sharp, but shortly. However, what it turns out, it's not that way. And most probably the shock will have more lasting effects, and the pre-pandemic level of activity will be reached by 2020. And this, importantly, is also conditioned on health situation, continuous monetary support, and very important assumption that there is no stronger effects or scarring on the economy. So what does it mean? It means that not just the growth has reversed, but the risks around this scenario has changed. This environment, just briefly to mention, what does this environment mean for the policies, macroeconomic policies? I think just recall, last year we were discussing normalization of the policies, too low for too long, exit strategies because of the need to rebuild the buffers and having in mind the side effects possible, especially vulnerabilities in the public sector. However, now, instead of witnessing normalization, we are facing the second wave of extra loose macroeconomic policies, which obviously seems inevitable at this context.
Thank you very much, Anita. You've given us quite a lot there to think about. Kyrylo, let me ask you, is everything different now, or is this just another crisis and we carry on managing things in the best way we can?
Okay, so I would like to stress the three main pillar of changes. So the one of them is the world become more digitalized. So this is the definite difference, the biggest difference in Ukraine as well, like it was and like it now. So also it's a good point to discuss the all changes in between fiscal and monetary policy as well. And I think that that the boundary between fiscal and monetary policy now is broad, but okay, it will be changed and it will become back. It will be back to the situation like it was before. And also the biggest, one of the biggest changes as well in Ukraine, it's due to digitalization, this implication of digitalization for the monetarist. So this is the this is very important for the central bank as well. And we on the side of challenges for the central banks, how we see the changes for the monetarism inside of the digitalization. So the economics become more complex, more globalized, and so it's the effect of the pandemic brings more speed and more challenges into the digital world as well. So this is my point of view. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Koba, same question to you, but I'd like you to pick up on what Kyrylo has just said, which is one of the topics that's whirling around in the background. The shift, the boundary between monetary and fiscal policy has shifted or has become more blurred. I'd be interested in your comment on that.
Okay, yeah, Chris, colleagues, greetings from Georgia. Definitely there have been changes. Nobody could have expected this kind of development this year. And just before exactly answering the question, just to recall, because I have been participating in the conferences for 4 years already, and I just wanted to look at my notes for last year. And last year I said that we always need to be ready for any crisis, because crises always come from different angles. And in fact, this is what happened this year, and the crisis came from the angle nobody could have expected. And to continue what my colleague Ukraine has mentioned, I think that this is a situation when fiscal and monetary authorities need to make sure that they work together and they synchronize their steps, especially in countries which had to take additional resources and increase the debt in order to deal with the hardship of pandemic to finance medical expenditures. In case of Georgia, when there was a need and the country borrowed financial resources from international financial organizations, and Georgia's state debt is approaching about 60% of GDP. I think that this is a time which we have to go through to make sure that with our timely actions, we go through this period of time, making sure that we address the issues of debt sustainability. The fact that we are under umbrella of IMF supported program greatly helps us to make sure that we have good checks and balances in terms of sustainability issues in Georgia. So I think that there have been some blurring, but we have to make sure that we address the challenges in a way that there is no fiscal dominance in the future. So fiscal policy, monetary policy, they definitely after the crisis need to do their job in a way they have been doing before. Thank you.
Gent, how does it look from your point of view?
Yes, hello and congratulations again for the perfect organization of this conference. I don't see quite differently from my previous colleagues talking about the crisis. We have been hit hardly as well from the crisis, and our economy has declined considerably, especially in the third quarter, but over a year we might have a drop in our GDP around 6%, which is, okay, relatively understandable, even compared to some countries, it's not quite a huge drop. However, economy has been hit strongly, and the role of the central bank, our role has been important as well. Definitely, we have been coordinating and cooperating with fiscal authorities, with Ministry of Finance, our role as monetary authority. Basically, we have been, in terms of monetary policy, we have been following a commoditary monetary policy, and we continued to easy monetary policy further pushed by this crisis. But on the other side, in terms of fiscal authorities, we have been going toward debt consolidation, reducing the debt, fiscal consolidation, while now we have changed, the government has changed the direction. The debt has been grown. It was a necessity to increase the debt in order to overcome the difficulties of the crisis temporarily, and then we have to go toward the fiscal consolidation later. There have been many changes. Basically, we played our role. There is a point to be emphasized, because this is a crisis which came from the health system, actually from pandemic virus. But on the other side, the financial system was very strong, was very good due to certain reforms, financial reforms undertaken specifically by the central bank, but also in overall. The banking sector was caught in a good situation by this crisis, full of liquidity and well capitalized. And the banking sector was quite a strong pillar to help the difficult situation in this crisis. In overall, we have been coordinating monetary policy with fiscal policy. However, I mean, there are so many implications. It's very complex. The role, we didn't go out of our role, but the role of the central bank took a certain emphasis, and here we are actually. But I don't want to repeat what the other colleagues said.
No, you've given me a perfect link to and I'll stay with you and tell me very quickly, and then we'll go to Boštjan and ask him.
Yes.
Given that we're in a time of sort of shifting perspectives and people's ideas about things are changing, whether we think there's a fundamental, radical, permanent change, or whether we think it's just something slightly new to manage, and I'd like you to tell me what, as the governor of a central bank, and you've been governor for 5 years, so you must have thought about this a lot. What is the role of a central bank?
Well, basically, we are in the same role, and I believe we'll continue to have the same role as a central bank. Our main role is price stability and the financial stability, and that is very crucial and very important to maintain during this crisis. I mean, price stability and financial stability is a crucial role. I just mentioned the role of the financial sector in this crisis, of the banking sector. Commercial banks played a very important role, supporting with liquidity. Also, the central bank supported with liquidity banking sector, but basically economy was supported with liquidity. And if we will not have had such a good financial situation, the crisis would have been harder. On the other side, price stability, which is the main role, inflation targeting of the central bank, it's very important because it's related directly with the welfare. There is with the welfare of the population. Basically, the monetary policy role, our instruments is playing this role, and during the crisis, we further decreased the interest rates in the minimum historical rate we want, and continue to inject liquidity harder in the banking sector. So basically, the role of the central bank is the same role, but it has taken more emphasis, more specific, and has been more important during this crisis, I would say. So I don't see any change in the role of the central bank, but on the other side, I mean, the role has been more focused. There is something that is also discussed very much. It's like conventional and unconventional monetary policy. Unconventional monetary policy is the quantitative easing. It's injecting liquidity further in the system, either directly financing the government or by investing in treasury bills in the market. Basically, developing countries like Albania, similarly in the region as well, are not exerting. We have not yet used quantitative easing, but this is a contingency fund.
You've gone to ultra-low interest rates, and as we know, ultra-low interest rates are a gateway drug to quantitative easing. So we shall ask the same question in a year's time. Boštjan, I'm sorry, we kept you waiting a long time, but please comment on what you've just heard. But I'd be interested to know, is the role of the central bank price stability, as it always was? That is the key thing, keep inflation under control. And I invite you also, as you're answering that question, to tell us about Slovenia's excellent experience already this year in the bond markets.
Thank you very much. First of all, good morning from Ljubljana as well, and greetings to my colleagues and organizers. Now, regarding your first question, is the situation different as compared to last year? Yes, in my opinion, its environment is completely different. What we discussed during past year, at the beginning of 2020, was more or less a normal business cycle, expected downturn, and we were discussing policies to mitigate these effects. But now, this year, we are facing with a crisis which is basically hitting us from the outside of the economic sphere. It's a medical crisis, first of all, and of course, our reaction to this was completely different. It was bold reaction from our central bank, from ECB, and also from the Bank of Slovenia. It was a swift reaction, and it was a timely reaction. But it's also different from previous crisis episodes is how the monetary and fiscal policies are coordinating. They are actually working hand in hand, and I think this is a very, very important factor which we will learn from this crisis. Of course, financing all the measures coming from the fiscal side, they're in need of monetary support. And what we did at the ECB was we tried to calm the markets to ensure that there will be functioning monetary policy in all the jurisdictions. And Slovenia, as you mentioned, was also benefiting from this situation. Past year was very successful for us in terms of bond markets, and we entered this year with a new issuance, which was for us for the first time in past modern history. This is in the past 30 years in the negative domain. So yes, I can agree that we started being very successfully, and for the continuation, we strengthened all at once.
And what you have just mentioned is kind of moving us towards what we're trying to do, part of this discussion at least, which is to define whether this crisis is different from earlier crises. And I'm going to go back, I'm going to come back in a moment to direct comparison with the 2008 global financial crisis, which seems like a long time ago now, but it's the obvious thing to reach for comparison. And to try to get to the bottom of this question as to whether what we're facing now is something very different. And this question of the merging of fiscal and monetary policy, which Kyrylo introduced to the discussion, is a crucial part of that. But before that, I just want to ask each of you again, just in really very practical terms, what was the first thing that you had to do? What were the central bank's immediate practical reactions to the start of the crisis? Anita, let's come back to you just very quickly, just one or two things. Was liquidity injected into the banking system? What were the immediate priorities on day one when you realized we had a crisis on our hands?
Mm-hmm. Okay, as I mentioned, it was unprecedented crisis, which meant also unprecedented challenges for the central banks. What we did and what were the major shocks that we faced at the beginning of the crisis is, first of all, lower inflows, lower capital and financial inflows, especially remittances, which play a significant role in our economy, but also to other economies in the region. Just to mention the size, to have a really general feeling, what is this? Remittances on average in the region account from 10 to 15% of GDP. So it was a huge shock that we felt at the beginning. Second transmission channel from the external environment that we felt was collapse of the external demand. At the beginning, it for us meant 60% decline of the export. In terms of the capital inflows, we didn't face as many other emerging economies outflows, though we witnessed frozening de facto of the international markets with lower inflows. What does this all mean for us? It meant shock to the foreign exchange market. In such a situation, when a country is pursuing a de facto stable exchange rate, it means need of immediate intervention on the foreign exchange market. So we were heavily intervening, especially at the beginning. It was the second quarter. And overall, we have lost about 15% of the official foreign reserves. However, this is significantly smaller amount that we have lost in comparison with the previous crisis. Second pillar, what was very important for us, injecting liquidity in the market. Why? Not just to support the credit flows in the domestic economy and thus help households and companies survive this really unexpected shocks that they were faced. But the second reason also was to help government, because banks are very important players on securities market. At that point, government didn't have enough liquidity to start immediately with the fiscal packages. So we, in a way, provided a bridge till they issued Eurobond, till international institutions provide support. So that was very important role that we played at the beginning. And as a result of such a reaction, intervening on the foreign exchange market, providing liquidity, reducing our conventional tool, which is main policy rate, when I look into perspective, I think our measures were effective, because the result is that despite the huge risk plunging confidence of all the agents in the economy, despite the huge shock in external flows, in economy which de facto pursues a monetary strategy of stable exchange rate, financial conditions, domestic financial conditions remain favorable. Just to mention, initial shock on international market in April, yields for our bonds, sovereign bonds, averagely increased 250 basis points. So we played our role. I think a very important move was ECB repo that we managed to got. Maybe we can come back later on this. But for us, access to external liquidity is really key because it defines the room that the monetary policy has in pursuing accommodative monetary policies.
It's interesting that, Anita, that you mentioned the market reaction back in April, because now it seems very distant, doesn't it? I mean, at that moment, everybody was looking at what markets were doing and they were going absolutely crazy. And you had that moment, for example, when oil had a negative price and all of that. Since then, markets have really just sort of shrugged this off completely. And Boštjan's recent bond issue is a negative interest rate bond. So how different markets are today in terms of reaction to the crisis. But Koba, let me turn back to you. What in Georgia? What was the first thing you did? What were the immediate practical steps, briefly, if you would? But also, I want to ask you, and I'm going to ask Kyrylo the same question. Given that you're both in IMF discussions, IMF programs, was the IMF kind of immediately on top of you and saying, what are you going to do? This is what we suggest you do. How did that dialogue work?
Okay. First of all, Chris, just very quick comment regarding 2008 crisis and this crisis. I think that main difference is that in 2008, financial sector was a reason for the crisis. And this crisis, because many things have been done in the direction, almost all the countries in the world, financial sector will be the driving force and will help the economies to get through the crisis. So that's how I see the difference between these two crises. The first thing, first of all, we already had an IMF program in Georgia, IMF supported program in Georgia. So we did not really need to have like a new program because the program was in place. And we knew exactly what to do. First of all, financial system was in a very good shape and with very good high quality capital and very good capital buffers and very good liquidity. But imagine the situation that Georgia, which is developing as a country of tourist destinations, and in 2019, tourism revenues amounted to 20% of GDP, and it has been growing over years. All of a sudden, just stopped receiving any tourism, and there was no revenues, absolutely. And also bearing in mind that currencies of our trading partners, Turkey and Russia, depreciated, there was a big pressure on the exchange rate of Georgian currency. So given that we have floating exchange rate in Georgia, which has been serving Georgian economy quite well in terms of absorbing the shock, because it works as an automatic stabilizer for Georgian economy, we had to devalue currencies. There was about 14% of devaluation of currency over time, but then it stabilized. We had to intervene in foreign exchange market, but given that Georgia maintained right macro policies, donors have been very generous in terms of supporting us. So even with these interventions, our gross international reserves remain at the historical high level, which is quite good for investors and for the future country. And liquidity, yes. We had to make sure that we inject liquidity. We have injected liquidity through commercial banks. We also gave some liquidity to microfinance institutions to make sure that credit flows would continue in Georgia. And with very low level of non-performing loans in the country, with very good quality of capital, we finished the year with about 10% growth in portfolio. And I think that we have been able to maintain macro stability in the country, which is most important. Down the road, we have a clear plan what to do because we have a temporary banking supervision plan. And even if the if the situation deteriorates even further, we still have capital buffers. So we took actions on many fronts. And just to add very quickly, we also had a repo agreement with the ECB. It was for the first time for Georgia, and we have not used it yet, but agreement is in place, and it will be extended very soon to March 2022.
Thank you. And you also have a new resolution mechanism for the banking sector, which is not something we can really go into now, but that's an important step.
Yes, that's an important step, even though we had a quite good experience in Georgia with liquidation of commercial banks. 2008 crisis also showed us that this instrument was necessary. So we did in a short period of time, we adopted this legislation. Of course, we worked with the parliament. So I think that this resolution framework is going to be additional feature to financial stability in Georgia.
Very good, thanks. Kyrylo, let me turn back to you and do say what the National Bank of Ukraine's immediate reactions were. But I'm interested too to know if you, obviously last year's deal with the IMF was a watershed moment for Ukraine. Did you have an immediate dialogue with them when the pandemic hit, or was that not part of your sort of to-do list on day one?
Okay, thank you. So the Ukrainian economy entered into the COVID-19 crisis in much better state than was in case during the global financial crisis in 2008. GDP growth was stable, inflation and the current account deficit were moderate. The National Bank of Ukraine had ample reserve. The level of government debt was relatively low, and the banking sector and public finance were healthy. As a result, the COVID-19 crisis is the first crisis in the history of Ukraine with no spike of inflation, no catastrophic decline in international reserves. Even we've ended the year with the highest level of fixed reserves for the last 8 years, and no dramatic falls of Ukraine's GDP. But it's easy to say now. But in the beginning of the crisis, we saw the GDP decline much worse than actually we get at the end of the year. We had expected the level -6%, and we've got the last figures for the 11 months. It's a -4.7%. So it's not so catastrophic like we expect. And we also stick to the policy of the floating exchange rate, and the exchange rate on the beginning, like my colleagues already mentioned, the exchange rate was the shock and depreciate, and so the exchange rate decreased by 15%. That's the shock we've been experienced. And in July, we entered to the new program with International Monetary Fund. And we haven't used the RFI instrument. We are still in the program of we are still in the SBE program with IMF. So it was the period between the beginning of the crisis and our communication to the IMF. Probably, so I wasn't in this position those time. Probably this was the reason why country hasn't used the rapid financial instrument from the IMF. But on the other hand, to be in the SBE program. It brings more advantages to Ukraine in terms of the reform, in terms of the improvement of the state management. And in terms of instrument, what the NBU has provided, apart from the simplified access to the financing for the bank, we also launch the interest rate swaps for the banks, which enable banks to manage their interest rate risk, long-term financing for a period from 1 to 5 years. And so we are not in the position to use quantitative easing. I guess that Ukraine is now not in the position, but the mix of the orthodox tools and the new instruments to support the economy. So it brings us, I guess, with the support of IMF, it brings us in a quite in a relevant good position in among the European countries.
Kyrylo, thank you. Can I just stay with you for a moment, just asking you one very quick question? When you took over last summer, your current position, and by the way, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention just before that, I saw that 2 days ago it was announced that you had hit the inflation target of 5% for the December 2020 numbers. So well done on that. But when you took over, one of the things that was widely reported was that your role was to emphasize the independence of the NBU. And I just wanted to ask you if you could tell us very quickly how you've done that.
Okay, so for me, the independence in my role as an NBU governor, and I'm pretty sure for any governor present here, I see an absolute priority to assure NBU, the National Bank of Ukraine, operation on independent basis. The NBU's independence relies on 4 components: institutional, operational, financial, and the personal independence. And during the crisis, Christopher and the colleagues, so we now have more experience that the independence, it's a key priority for any central bank, and Ukrainian central bank is not exception in terms of the independence and the key role of independence of central bank.
Thank you very much. Not an easy question to answer, I realize, but thank you very much indeed for telling us that. And good luck as the role continues. Boštjan, what was the first thing that happened in Slovenia?
Now, given the scale of the crisis and the lockdown, which was imposed very early as compared to some other countries, first thing we did was we prepared different scenarios, what will happen to the most affected sectors. It was a very novel situation for us, having such a large part of the economy being closed down almost completely. So this was the first down to chart the territory where we were moving in. Then immediately after that, we realized that additional liquidity will be needed. And basically, we reintroduced ABP. We also realized very early in the process that huge fiscal support, which were coming from various governments, will need additional support from the monetary side as well. So when we detected the tensions of the financial markets, we introduced special pandemic instruments. The first one being PEP, and we also modified the territory instrument. So basically, we went for a huge increase of liquidity and towards easing of financing conditions. Now, as for the Bank of Slovenia, especially, we, of course, with the previous financial crisis still resonating in terms of consequences for the banking sector, we were very careful about what's going on in the Slovenian banking sector. And basically what we did, we reintroduced some of the procedures we implemented already in in the previous financial crisis, 2013, 2014. So we started with more detailed monitoring of the banking system, with what's going on with their credit activity, what's going on with their non-performing loans, with their portfolios, and of course checking how the banks are prepared if situation would have worsened.
Thank you. Gent, I want to ask you a slightly different question, and this is the beginning of the questions that we will wrap up with. The time, of course, has been against us. Looking forward into the rest of this year and beyond, what do you think is going to be different? We started off talking about rethinking the role of central bankers. I'd like to ask you, what do you think is going to be fundamentally different, A, in terms of how you do your job and how the central bank in Albania operates, but also B, more broadly in the world as a whole? What is the fundamental shift that we will see? And please, I'm going to ask each of you the same question, so just a minute in answering from each of you, please. Again, you first.
Yes, basically, as I mentioned, I don't think we will fundamentally change the role of the central bank. Basically, maintaining our independency will continue to play, and we should continue to play the major roles as a central bankers. Inflation targeting, maintaining price stability and financial stability, and of course, all other using the instruments of the central bank. However, this crisis was unprecedented, and we have been seeing ourselves playing this role in specific and under different circumstances. And in this situation, actually, we have to see our role, and we have to see how the central bank will continue to play the role and have the higher impact in the economical growth. For example, I mentioned as well before that we have not been using quantitative easing, but maybe in the future we might need to use quantitative easing. Independency of the central bank, it's a prerequisite, but on the other side, we should not mess up with the coordination of the central bank with the fiscal authorities and with the government. This does not mean that we are not independent. We have to cooperate, but within the legal framework, but maintaining our independence. In this situation, if there will be a prolongation of the crisis, we will need to use quantitative easing. We have to frame and be within a certain regulatory framework, maybe some legal changes, or maybe we have to discuss with ECB that quantitative easing could be treated as a normal instrument for central bank usage.
Well, you can ask them how well it's worked for them in the last generation.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. Well, this is actually absolutely that has had a certain impact, mostly in developing countries. In developing countries, we have been providing liquidity through foreign debt, Eurobond, through banking sector, local banking sector, through different sources, but yet we have not used quantitative easing, but maybe in the future we might need to use. So in terms of usage of instruments, we have to see the role of the central bank in the future. But however, never forgetting and never moving from our major role, which is price stability and financial stability, and always maintaining our independence. Because if we do not maintain our independence, then we can mess up and do not play not only our role, but also our impact will be different.
Gent, your message is loud and clear, but it's left much less time for your colleagues to to comment, but that's,
I am over. Thank you.
yeah, that's fine. You everything you said, I'm sure they will all agree with. Koba, come in and tell us just one thing that's going to be
Okay, given that time constraint, I'll be very short. I think that we have to embrace more the concept of fixed roof while the sun is still shining. That's what I would emphasize at this point. Thank you.
Okay, Kyrylo, are you fixing your roof whilst the sun is shining?
Yeah, we have, and due to the time we have, I guess the key role in this process will play the digitalization. This is my favorite theme. This is my favorite topic to discuss, and it takes much more time than we have. But I'd like to thank for the chance to part in this discussion today. Thank you.
Well, one of the many questions which we've left undiscussed on our original agenda was whether pandemic accelerates or decelerates digitalization of government services and banking services. But we'll have to run a separate panel on that. I'd love to be involved and hear your answers. Boštjan, very quickly, looking to the future, what's different?
Now, what will stay the same is our main objection, which is stability in terms of inflation, stability in terms of financial stability. But what will, where we will move our focus is with the receding of the virus. Hopefully, we will put all our attention to supporting the recovery instead of mitigating the negative effects of the current crisis.
Thank you. And Anita, here we are. In our end is our beginning. We keep saying, we've all used this word unprecedented over and over again. It's been the most used word of 2020. But notwithstanding all that unprecedentedness, tell us something you're going to do differently, or really if most of it's going to be the same: clever management, wise policy, steady hand on the tiller. You're to close our discussion.
Okay, maybe here I would just quickly like to reflect on the role of the central banks and central banking. I think some of my colleagues mentioned that fundamentally the role hasn't been changed, more or less, fundamental role is price stability, but just not to forget that before the pandemics, there was already ongoing process of rethinking the objectives, monetary strategy, instruments that the central banks have at their disposal. Just one thing to remember, that global financial crisis reminded us that price stability is not a guarantee for the financial stability, that financial stability can have a long-lasting impact, so which has clearly resulted in broadening of the objectives of the central bank. Many other questions, time horizon of achieving our objectives, whether the inflation targeting will remain the most appropriate strategy, whether this conventional instrumentarium will come back, or unconventional instrumentarium will remain. What does this crisis mean? I think pandemics just gives another more reason to continue with rethinking of the central banking. Why? Because it is a crisis that will leave structural shifts in the economy. And why are they important for us? Of course, structural shifts are beyond the scope of the central banks, but they significantly affect the link between the economy and inflation. That is the Phillips curve. It in particular affects two important aspects or structural shifts that are already ongoing. You mentioned digitalization or globalization. Just to shed some light on globalization, the key question is now, is it going to accelerate further, or we are going to see a reversal because all the shortcomings we have been seeing? And one number just that I recently looked, if in the last decade, globalization or trade integration of the Central and Southern Eastern Europe increased by 10 percentage points, last year, only for 3 quarters of the year, it declined by 5 percentage point. So a lot of structural shifts, I think we should expect and continue thinking more profoundly for our role. Thank you.
Anita, thank you very much. I'm getting panic messages in the chat box saying we have to wrap up. We've run over by a couple of minutes. Thank you very much, though, for finishing us off there. Thank you for giving us plenty to think about, all of you. A great pleasure to have all of you on the panel. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your attendance. We look forward to meeting again in different circumstances before too long.